Hi, I'm Damian Sanford, and today I'll be talking about the importance of attention. So my thesis is that the cognitive process of attention, both voluntary and involuntary, plays a larger role in humans' eventual thoughts and actions than was pre-theoretically thought and contributes to what makes humans distinct as a species. So in the 1920s, there was a reframe of what the field of cognitive neuroscience was focused on, and it was called the behaviorist revolution. And the concept of attention was kind of put on the back burner. So basically all I'm saying is that it should be brought to the forefront of studies of cognitive neuroscience, and that it plays a bigger role than we think in everyday action. So a quick review of the different types of attention. In our textbook, attention is defined as a helpful filter that allows humans to navigate a world of a large variety of sensory inputs in a productive way. And there were a few distinctions made between different types. One type of attention was exogenous attention, which is externally triggered attention with regards to the mind or brain, versus endogenous, which is internally triggered attention. So if something outside of us, like a large sound or loud noise, happens, then that's what we're automatically going to turn our focus to. And there can be internal, either biological symbols or thoughts in your mind that are recurrent that are internally triggered types of attention. There's also a distinction between top-down frameworks for attention versus bottom-up. Top-down being attention starts with cognition and goes outward, and then the other bottom-up approach starting with sensory input and causing a reaction in the brain from there. The other philosopher and scholar that I looked at for this paper was Ocasio, and he defined attention similarly, but with a slightly nuanced difference, as a focused effort that incorporates a variety of interrelated mechanisms and processes in or to prioritize, notice, encode, interpret incoming stimuli. So he makes three distinctions between the types of attention, and those are selective attention, attentional vigilance, and executive attention. Selective is one of the most important forms, he says, because it allows you to focus on specific stimuli. And he thinks that without this selective attention, we would pretty much just be always passively perceiving things. So connectivist architectures sometimes struggle to include this, but Ocasio thinks it's central to our eventual action and very important. Second form is attentional vigilance, which allows us to sustain concentration on a specific stimuli. And there's also executive attention, which connects to the other two and brings it together in order to make decisions and to problem solve. Ocasio also covers 5 meta-theories attempting to solve the problem of cohesiveness with the top-down and bottom-up approaches. I won't go into detail on those, but he says that basically solves the binding problem. So moving on to the philosophical view of attention, William James was the philosopher who focused most on this process of cognition and went into the most detail. And his definition is attention happens when something takes possession over the mind with regard to one possible input. He comes at this problem in a fairly personal way, using his observations in his life to create his theory. And he distinguishes between sensory versus intellectual attention, and this is where covert and overt forms of attention stem from that we discussed in our textbook. It also connects to voluntary and involuntary types of attention. Involuntary being you focus on something that you didn't necessarily actively choose to focus on, but it comes to the forefront of your brain. And voluntary meaning attention where you intentionally focus on a specific stimuli or specific thought and give that your main focus. He identifies 3 psychological processes that involve attention. The first is the accommodation or adjustment of the sensory organs. The second is the anticipatory preparation from within of ideational centers concerned with the object to which the attention is paid. And the third is an afflux of blood to the ideational center. All of this to say that attention is a neurological process in the brain. So the overarching argument here is that without attention, thoughts would only be passively perceived. The unique quality of clarity that comes with human cognitive process of attention allows one to react to the events transpiring around them accordingly and efficiently. Other facets of the argument involve that the ability to navigate and create complex systems in the workplace, technology, the brain, and really any medium is reliant on attention, whatever the definition or framework one chooses to accept. For example, it takes attention and focus to complete a project like this, and sometimes some will struggle with that more than others. But any productive work done by humanity has to involve attention in some way, because that's the way that we are able to pick out one thing from another. And we would kind of be in this state, it seems, of frozenness or of like in a liminal space without being able to act on the thoughts that we have, which is what attention does. Humans' innate biological responses for survival are dependent on attention. Our feelings of like suspicion or intuition have to do with paying attention to stimuli or a lack of stimuli. And that's kept us alive and productive for the entirety of human history. Off of that, though, these biological responses can relate to animals too. Something that's, I think, unique to humans is that we create more complex systems, and we have more complex decision making, and also actions have been directly linked to attentional processes. So the evidence here is that despite varying definitions and approaches, the reason to redefine and clarify those terms at the beginning was no matter the conception of attention, most if not all the philosophers say that action, thought, or decision making is involved with or entirely reliant on attention, and that each of these types of attention has a particular functionality. That sustains even if attention is not required for consciousness in a certain theory. So in the textbook, Jennings writes that the idea is that attention is necessary for action because action requires the selection of one from many possible actions, a specific pairing of stimulus to response. So again, this basically just means attention is the way that we process stimuli. We couldn't do it quite as effectively in another way. James's conception of the self was tied to his definition of attention, and that definition has been able to gain credibility scientifically, which we'll look at in a moment. But that's only really relevant because James's conception of the self is very centered on humanity. And so it shows how attention is, in a way, this uniquely human process outside of just creature consciousness. Ocasio writes that our discussion in his paper of attentional engagement suggests that attentional similarity across communication channels and organizational levels is critical for organizational learning and change. And he overviews a study of a corporation where he looked at the higher management and what they prioritized and spent time on and gave attention to, and then measured the productivity levels and the overall symbiosis of the workspace. And he's saying that looking at paying attention to attention, that's what his paper's called, gave the company a better idea of how to structure their time in order to be the most efficient. So some scientific evidence in this really just scratches the surface, but mostly comes from the paper that was relating William James's definition to neuronal process. And the first thing that was mentioned was a 1950s experiment that showed when a lesser group of quote-unquote relevant stimuli was pulled from a larger group of quote-unquote irrelevant stimuli, and shown to a subject, the smaller group would eventually determine the amount of learning and probability of a response. But initially, the irrelevant stimuli was distracting from pulling out the actual information that they needed or that the scientists were testing for. And so over time, though, they were able to learn and sustain attention on a specific thing. And that shows the ability to critically think and make decisions over a period of time, which supports the idea that attention is the way that we do that. There were studies done where the ventral occipital lobe was triggered by asking people to identify specific word shapes, and the posterior parietal lobe was triggered when attending to location. So all I was just saying is that different parts of the brain, when asking people to do tasks that involve attention, were triggered based on the type of stimulus that was being intaken. Ocasio writes, in regards to the same study referenced earlier, research findings support that the view that attentional engagement and forward-looking attentional perspectives facilitate firms' ability to overcome inertial properties and to exercise managerial discretion. So the reason why I chose this as my thesis is because I think that in contemporary media, there are a lot of examples of attention being largely important. So for example, in Harry Potter, all magic is only able to be used when intently focused on, and either inadvertently, when they're untrained, a large emotion can trigger that attention to certain detail, or purposefully eventually when they're trained later. These are just some of my favorite contemporary examples. There are many that you can find. But I'll go to the last one in a show called Psych. This is a less magical example. This guy who's really, his father was a detective, but he's just a guy, is able to pass as a psychic just because he has a heightened sense of attention and awareness. So he's able to pick out specific things from a scene that other people can't notice. And that makes him able to fool everybody, basically, that he is connected to a higher realm. So the point of including these examples is obviously not that the process of attention is anything spooky or like necessarily exterior to us, but it's a high point of interest in humanity in general. And just that fact means that it should be studied more and understood more, as it's something that I think universally is recognized as important, whether it's referenced in a scientific context or just in a general context. So there's some criticisms. As with any neurobiological theory, allowances must be made for the theory of attention regarding the origin. Much of this is theoretical, so even though we have scientific findings about where in the brain certain things are active, it's not an end-all be-all conclusion ever. Since attention connects to other neurobiological theories of mind, distinguishing what exactly the effect of this process is compared with others, so perception, consciousness, recall, and memory, and how they may pair together, is of high debate. Some possible further directions for this topic, and most of these are coming from the philosophers that I looked at, is finding out how and where top-down and bottom-up approaches lie, not just for individuals, but organizations. Distinguishing between base perception and attention, and why attention is maybe a little bit of a higher order process, and then further research into how technology or other newly created stimuli is or are affecting our attention. And the philosopher Catherine Hales, who I did not discuss here, has admittedly done a lot of work in this area, but it was a little too much to go into. So in conclusion, the theory of attention as a cognitive process deserves to be recognized as one of the more important functions of the human brain due to its great influence on thought and action. Giving attention more leeway in the field of cognitive science could lead to a better understanding of social dynamics and therefore better societal communication overall.